hospital. He was in the hospital,
Wow.
and
Wow.
he still isn't, doing.
Yeah.
And I don't know which brother it is. I don't
Well, there
know.
was the oldest brother. He was a little bit sick. I mean, I heard he went home a day before the dad. But I don't know the inside. I mean, right now, I heard Arizona's numbers are highest in the world.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
Today.
comforting.
Yeah, so that's just an interesting statistic. Stay safe, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
there were a couple beautiful things about New York, which I took back. So I didn't go to the heavily crowded places, which was my first time in my life that I actually was in New York, and I didn't go there because everyone told me, they said that basically all the locals aren't getting sick, but there's a lot of visitors in New York. So people told me, they said, if you go over there, if you go to 770, you'll get sick. So I went to 770 Friday afternoon when it's basically empty. That's when they're cleaning it and no one's there. And I went there. I mean, that's the only time I went in. Otherwise, we were outside. My father-in-law's shul, everyone was sick. And my father-in-law actually still has antibodies. It's 9 months later. He still gets tested because it's very easy to test in New York. And also, if you want to live regularly, you have the ability to just go to get tested. It takes a couple minutes. And so he still has antibodies 9 months later, as do many in his synagogue. Now, his synagogue is very interesting. It's a very small synagogue. Mainly people, I would say, 50s and up. Just give me a second. Mainly people who are 50s and up. And what was interesting is everyone there had gotten sick. Some of them heavily, some of them not as much. As a result, they all work out in the gym. They all work out in the gym together in like a rehab facility that was put together. And it was kind of interesting. The camaraderie was very strong. We were one of the only people in Crown Heights wearing masks, just because, everyone's been doing it for a long time. And I'm not judging them. I mean, every single person was sick. That's a local. Again, I didn't really hang out. Like the super spreaders are like weddings, people come in for weddings and simchas. 770, they say, is like a super spreader place. Most of the students there and teachers there, you see, they walk around regularly, but some of them were in the hospital for months and they survived. And everyone, I mean, pretty much everyone there gets tested all the time. And they also, people have antibodies, try and continue testing to see how long they can last, so they can, visit or help other people who didn't get sick yet. They are able to.
Which test are they having? The quick
the antibody test? I don't know. The reason why I don't know. The reason why I know a little bit about it. So we actually already got tested. Mendel had symptoms on Friday. And Mushka, the kids had symptoms on Friday.
I love you.
So they had rapid tests and they were negative.
I love you. I love you.
1 second. Bracha, you will take Shana. So the kids,
How does that work,
had a
though,
rapid
Rabbi?
test.
I'm sorry. I was just going to ask you, some of those tests, though, if I'm understanding correctly, they can be tested again, and then they are like, it's not always like surefire that first
So,
test. I don't
this
know
is what they
what
say.
they told you.
So this is what they say. Now, I don't know about which antibodies test it is, but I know that, to Phyllis's question, I know that people basically were telling me like, oh, just go while you're here. It's so easy to do it. And maybe you have antibodies. You never know. Just go get tested. I just didn't have the time to do it. But there they have it arranged that people can get tested very frequently. Now, as far as the other tests go, the rapid test, they say, won't work unless you have symptoms. The rapid test won't work unless you have symptoms. Now, the rapid test will tell you if you're a positive, but if you don't have symptoms, it's difficult to tell you it's a negative. So if you're taking, let's say, the rapid test, or even a regular test, won't tell you unless you have enough symptoms for it. So what they tell you is basically, let's say you just have a cold. So if you get the test and you're negative, then you're probably negative. However, that's for like Mendel, he just had the sniffles and a sore throat. So we took him in and he was negative. But let's say you have no symptoms and you were exposed to someone. Someone who has COVID and you had contact with them. If you get tested, then it won't be able to really tell you anything if you're negative, because you were exposed and you have to wait till you get symptoms. So I don't know. Again, I'll probably test sometime this week because, I had a nephew who had a cold last Shabbos, little kid, 2-year-old. And they said, oh no, it's not COVID because all of their family gets tested and antibodies and everything like that. So I said, well, great. My kids are probably going to get a cold by playing with them. So they did, and we got tested and they were negative. But you never know because, you know, you take a flight back, you don't know who you're sitting next to, you don't know. And then you go to the gas station. I mean, you don't know, you don't know until you're safe at home. So as of now, no one in my family has COVID symptoms, any COVID symptoms. Now, just before we start studying, this is actually on YouTube, so I guess, but no one can be seen except for me. I'll just tell you kind of something funny. I had a worker come in on Thursday. So I was wearing a mask and I said, you know, I was just on a flight, you know, I just want to make sure. And he said, you know, I got lucky. I donated blood to hospital and I have antibodies. He said, I didn't expect it or anything like that. I donated blood and I have antibodies. Apparently one time I had COVID, but that's what everyone dreams about, but very few actually have that.
Hi, Mando.
On your flight, Rabbi? Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to ask you, on your flight, were they socially distancing on the flight, or were you next to each other?
You're next to people. Now we basically get a whole row. Thankfully,
Right.
Shoshana kept her mask on because you can get kicked off your flight if the 2-year-olds don't.
Oh, yeah.
You know, flights,
But the rest of the plane?
well, they're going to tell you that they don't need to socially distance because they have special filters and everything like that. I
Yes.
mean, but it's just, you know, that's obviously they're just their business and they have their scientists saying their things. I have a friend who's in the filter business and he told me like, oh yeah, if schools would replace their glass walls for filters, it would be much better actually. But again, you know, no one really knows. So you got to take the, you know, it's obviously a little bit of a risk. Like my wife's grandmother lives in Israel and she hasn't been out of her house in months. So my father-in-law plans on going to visit her. Now that's why he keeps getting tested for antibodies because he wants to fly to Israel safely and then go to her house and he's not gonna get her sick and he's not sick. And also another thing, I mean, everyone's saying in New York is saying that the people who are hit, the harder you were hit, the longer your antibodies last. I don't know if that's proven, but that's just amongst, well, so that amongst the people, everyone's getting tested there. So amongst people, anecdotally, the people, let's say my father-in-law who were really hit hard have had antibodies already 9 months. And other people have had them for 4 months, 5 months, you know. So anyways, that was a kind of interesting experience. All right, well, yeah.
When the children are tested, is that the nose swab or?
So I bring my children to get tested in preference to us. Now, I brought Mendel because Mendel had symptoms. They doing a nose swab, yeah. I mean, so basically they'll give them, if you have symptoms, they'll give you a rapid test. If you don't have symptoms, they won't. I brought Mendel because he had symptoms and, you know, there are always some people coming around and stuff like that. I want to make sure that he's negative and he was negative. It's also a lot easier if you bring your kids. There's a lot less wait. They're much more quick with results. They're much more than the regular because the demand and the supply, the demand is much less. So it's always helpful to bring the kiddos. We brought all three of our older kids so far have been tested for different things negatively, thankfully. And we'll see this week. We'll see that in Phoenix, they're giving regular swab tests, and they're lasting they're giving results in 24 hours. Here, people are getting tests like on Monday and getting it a week later. So that's kind of inconvenient. But anyways, so let's study. So I want to talk about a couple things. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Bo. Bo means come. That's what it literally means. It's the second Parsha of the 10 plagues. We had 7 last week, 3 this week. Moses is going into Pharaoh back and forth. You know, Pharaoh keeps saying, no, we got 3 more plagues to go. And the plagues, interestingly in the Torah, we go through them pretty quickly. We have in this week's Parsha the first mitzvah in the Torah. God takes Moses outside and shows him the new moon and says, you know, when the moon is full, you guys are going to leave. But we have the mitzvah of calculating the moon, when the new moons are. We have the mitzvah of the goats. We have the mitzvah, of the lambs, the Paschal lamb this week, which was quite dramatic. The Paschal lamb, the lambs were one of the idols in Egypt, and every Jew was meant to take one into his house. It was quite a dramatic experience. And then we have we have the plague of the firstborns, and that's the end of this week's parsha. Now, another thing that happens this week is what's called Yud Shvat. Yud Shvat is a Hasidic holiday. I actually flew into New York last year for Yud Shvat. That was my pre-COVID flight. Now, this year, I figured, that's probably a pretty easy place. If you go in next Shabbos, it's probably pretty easy time to get COVID because there's probably gonna be a bunch of people flying in. So I went, we went, it was actually my first quiet Shabbos in New York in probably 10 years, probably 6 years since I moved here. I mean, I didn't go to any of the crowds. There was nothing happening. It was regular, basically with my wife's family the whole time. So anyways, that was also an interesting experience. So Yud Shvat is Shabbos. Now it is the 71st anniversary of the previous Rebbe passing away and the 70th anniversary of the Rebbe becoming Rebbe. And I want to talk about a couple of things. It's related to this Parsha. There were a lot of themes the Rebbe spoke about it. And primarily, the Rebbe really spoke about Yud Shvat being like the message, the day of our generation. Yud Shvat means the 10th of Shvat. So it's the 10th day of the month of Shvat. That is the day the previous Rebbe passed away. The previous Rebbe was very sick, but it was a little bit by surprise because he was very sick for many years, and he was still all there. He passed away Shabbos morning, and it was devastating for many Hasidim, but there were a couple interesting things which happened. So to start, the previous Rebbe passed away, but he had set out a discourse to give on the day he passed away. Yud Shvat was also the yahrzeit. Yud Shvat and Yud Gimel Shvat were the yahrzeit of his mother and grandmother. And he had put together like a speech to give out to people. It was written, an essay to give out. So the Rebbe said, everything's divine providence. And especially with a great Rebbe, they know much more than we know. So this essay is the relevant mission for our life. This essay. Now, I want to talk about that essay today, and I want to talk about the Parsha a little bit. And there's a lot of messages which the Rebbe said are especially relevant to our generation, and we'll go into that. It's very interesting. So actually, every year, the Rebbe would take. There were 20 paragraphs in the essay. It was long. 20 paragraphs in such an essay is considered very long, and every line is action-packed. I mean, bringing hundreds of sources and explanations, But the Rebbe every year would take a paragraph of that essay, and he would elucidate it, he would discuss it, he would explain it, he would ask questions on it. And till today, people study the coinciding year. We've been going on this cycle. So I want to just go into a little bit. I think it's very interesting. Now, it's important to remember that the previous Rebbe spent many years of his life suffering. He basically became Rebbe at the beginning of communist Russia. He was arrested, sentenced to death, whole 9 yards. And then, of course, right after, hit by the Holocaust. He himself was a Holocaust survivor. I mean, he wasn't in a concentration camp, but they were dropping bombs on his head, on his houses and everything like that. And he came to America, and yet he found America to be more disturbing than everything he had lived through.
Oh, come on.
And it's very interesting, actually. It's very contextually. I think many of our great-grandparents felt the same way. It was very difficult in America to imagine Jewish continuity. And that was something that they all wanted. I remember actually hearing about a guy in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Not in Canada.
Well, so, Canada is interesting because Canada is very large. But of course, there's different areas in Canada, probably, But I'll give you an example.
Well, no, what I meant, Rabbi, is yeah.
Well, so, in America, you had a mixture of people who had joined the big city. You're cutting out, Rochelle. You're cutting out. You'll tell me about Canada when you're back on.
They came with the determination. I felt so grateful to be there.
Yeah, well, so that's an interesting thing. So historically, in America,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you cut out, but I'll touch upon that. So there were many families in America, like I think Rochelle's community, which
Yeah, I'm sorry.
which had the determination to be Jewish, and they created Jewish support systems. Many of them lived in like a town where they would go and they would be strong about it. There were many Jews on all sides assimilating, and things were difficult.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I don't want to focus on that too much because I want to focus on the actual textual study. But the way the Rebbe put it is the previous Rebbe. So when he came to America, there was a large entourage, the previous Rebbe, greeting him. And people kind of told him like, hey, Rabbi, cool it down a little bit. This is America. America already, many Jews had assimilated. There were many Jews, there were different types of Jews. There were Jews that were steadfast to Judaism in the big cities. Many of their children assimilated. There were obviously some who didn't. There were Jews who lived on farms. Some of them would create almost like Jewish ghettos. I mean, there was really all sorts, but the previous Rebbe came and he said, his first speech was, we're going to make America Jewish. We're going to make, obviously not America Jewish, but Jews are going to flourish in America. And people kind of told him right away, like, cool it, Rabbi, we know that you suffered a lot, but this isn't the place. And actually the previous Rebbe says his first night in America was one of his most difficult nights. He was just crying the whole night. He was, it was just because he got such a kind of cold welcome. Everyone was happy to see him, and people were even willing to support him and support his movement, but they didn't want him to bother the American infrastructure. So the previous Rebbe, now we have an interesting correlation in the Torah. We find that the Zohar says that Moses, the Zohar is the famous Kabbalistic book, treatise by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We find that Moses, this week's Parsha, doesn't say go to Paro, go to Pharaoh. It says come to Pharaoh, come to Pharaoh. So the Zohar says Moses turns to God and he says, I can't go to this crocodile of a human. He was scared of Pharaoh. We're talking Moses. We're not talking about, one of us. We're talking Moses, who actually sees God in the world everywhere and is extremely spiritual. He said, I can't go to this crocodile who's, within chamber, and God tells him, don't be afraid. I'm coming with you. This is what the Rebbe told, this is what God told Moses. And this is a similar kind of message the Rebbe gave to a lot of Jewry. So we'll talk about that and we'll relate it, but I really want to focus on the mimer. The mimer is the essay of the previous Rebbe, which the Rebbe discussed every year. And I want to just show you some interesting things that it says. And we will see kind of a new perspective to the world. Now, the Rebbe actually one year spoke, and he said the previous Rebbe had two things were his main things. One thing was he felt that every Jew has to further the spread of Judaism. I'll read a letter today, a very fascinating letter of what the Rebbe meant. I mean, obviously, some people do it financially. Some people do it by teaching other people. Some people do it by studying themselves. That's right. A lot of times people say, Rabbi, how do we guarantee Jewish continuity? And I always tell them by acting Jewish. That's how you become the continuation of Judaism. But the Rebbe had this idea, we have to spread Judaism and spirituality everywhere. And the previous Rebbe also, in the Mimer actually, he said, you have to do it with zrizis. You have to do it with alacrity. You can't wait for other people to do it. You can't wait for other people to do it because who knows when it will get done. When you have an opportunity to do something good in the world, you have to jump on the opportunity, seize the opportunity, and be successful at it. So these two themes were actually in the Mimer, and I'll tell you a little bit about the Mimer. Now I'm going to, let me see if I can share the screen here. All right, give me a second. I'm going to share screen. All right, so everyone can see this over here. Oh, okay.
Yep.
All right, so I'm going to show you the name of the Mimer, and you can see it online. Very interesting set of Mimer. They're somewhat difficult. This is Basi Legani. That's what it's called. Oh, sorry. Basi Legani. It means literally, I came to my garden. Now, the previous Rebbe, one of the wars that he was fighting in America with Jewry was very interesting, actually. There were many Jewish people who were in America, and they felt like, from a Jewish perspective, this is an evil place. There were Jews who felt this is a great place and Judaism is obsolete. And there were Jews who felt, no, this place is, Judaism will continue, but the only way we can do it is by sheltering ourselves and living as Jews outside of the world. We cannot live within the world. These were the two attitudes that Jewish people had in America. Again, so there were Jews who said this place is absolutely amazing and Judaism is obsolete. I mean, we look at the movies from the era of the 40s. That's what they're all about. They're about Jews coming and they have this divide. Some Jews saying, this is amazing, we got to change things up. And some Jews saying, no, the old country is the way it's got to be. We have to go and seclude ourselves, shelter ourselves, and we can't mix. And that is actually the struggle in the early 1900s, probably till around 1950s, that Jews had. And it was usually one or the other. The previous Rebbe was the opinion, he said, no, we cannot just seclude ourselves. We have to go out and we have to transform America and make America, which is a free country, which is a good country, into a place where Judaism flourishes. Now, what's interesting about that is sometimes people do lose hope. Sometimes things do seem so bad and we struggle so much, or Judaism might struggle, that sometimes we give up. And here's how the previous Rebbe started this mimer. The mimer started with a midrash. The midrash said like this, Basi Legani. The verse in Song of Songs, anyone here heard of Song of Songs? Song of Songs is a book written by King Solomon in which describes the romantic relationship between Jewish people and God. So it says, Basi Legani achaisikala, I came to my garden. God says when the Torah was given, he says, I came back to my garden. When God gave the Torah to the Jewish people at Sinai, he revealed himself, he came back to his garden. So the Midrash right away says, it doesn't say he came back to the garden. God says, I came back to my garden. That was the place that I was originally. What happened was there were a bunch of famous people who sinned. Adam, right? He ate from the forbidden fruit. Cain killed Abel, right? All these different sins happened, and God was no longer comfortable in this world. But when the Torah was given, God said, I am now ready to come back. So the first thing that's important to remember is this world is a garden. As crazy as the world looks and as evil as we see in the world, it's important to remember that this world is actually a garden. It's God's garden. And just because we don't see him now, it's temporary. But he always will come back. And that's the first thing the previous Rebbe taught, that when we're viewing the world, we can't view the world as a place where, although in many places in the Psalms, it says the world is a place where evil people succeed. The world is a place where Rishayim Goivrim by evil people overpower. The world is a place that's full of potential evil. There's all sorts of evil going on. But Basi Legani, we have to remember that God will come back to his garden. It's actually his garden and nothing is here by chance. So that's how the previous Rebbe viewed the world, with all the evils that he saw in communist Russia, with all the evils that he saw he was in Poland during the Holocaust. And he said, nevertheless, this world is a garden. We have to remember that we have the ability to transform the garden. That is one point that the previous Rebbe stressed in this mimer. It's very long, but that is one point. When we're looking at the world, we can't forget that God is in charge of everything in the world, and he's actually running everything in the world. And it's our job to go around and reveal it. The previous Rebbe, at the end of the first section, he says that a Jew always has to say to himself, I cannot push off till tomorrow. We have to do it today. Now, when we're looking at the world, there's kind of two attitudes, and I get this all the time. If the world is a garden and God's in charge, right? And ultimately, this world will become good and a dwelling place for God. So ultimately, the evil we see is just temporary and it's just a stage. And, we'll pass the stage. It's like kids, sometimes with kids, there's like a problem, whatever it is, and then they grow out of it, So ultimately, we know God will come back and reveal himself in this world. Sometimes we might have the feeling that, yeah, we could push it off. There's no rush. There's no point in getting things done and spreading Judaism. So to this, the previous Rebbe says, this is something a person has to do every day. He has to say, am I doing enough? Did I do enough to help bring God back into this world? And this is one of the messages of the Basi Legani. Even though it's true that the world will return to the way it was before, nevertheless, we always have to remember that it's through us. It's through us, and we have a job given by us to God to do it now. Now, there's actually an interesting thing, which the Rebbe once got in a discussion about this. We know that, after 120 years, people die sometimes, right? People die, right, Jerry?
That's true.
People die. So
Yep.
sometimes, one can ask a valid question. What's the point of exerting effort and making the world a better place if eventually I'll die? So different people will answer all sorts of different things. But a lot of times there'll always be that one person who remains with the question. Some people might say, you got to give your effort to the world. You got to give your gift to the world, your legacy. But, some people might say no, I thought when I die, there'll be nothing left. So here's a very interesting lesson that we find that I want to share with you. Now in Adam, we know that Adam sinned. And before Adam sinned, everyone lived forever. Adam would have potentially lived forever. When he sinned, he brought death into the world. Now, in Judaism, we believe that a person lives, they typically die. There's a few exceptions like Elijah the prophet. Some say there's 9 people who didn't die in history. What did they do? What do you do if you don't die? You go up to heaven in fire, right? Their bodies didn't die. But most people die. Now, the Midrash tells us something very interesting. It says that when Mashiach comes, there'll be resurrection of the dead, right? There'll be resurrection of the dead. So people will become alive again. So even though one might say, hey, what's the point of exerting effort? I'm going to die and not have any of this. I just saw an article today about Sheldon Adelson. So Sheldon Adelson did a lot of, for many, many years, he's done a lot of righteous deeds. But the article was basically saying it doesn't matter how wealthy you are, at his funeral, they barely have a minyan, right? Because in Israel, with the they're in a lockdown now. And there were many great people who died this year, unfortunately. So sometimes someone might have that feeling when I die. Now, the Torah luckily tells us that there'll be resurrection of the dead. But furthermore, it's not just that we'll be resurrected. We'll be resurrected in a way that we actually never die. In every Jewish person, there's a bone, which in Jewish tradition never deteriorates. I always give the comparison to DNA. It's called the luz bone in Hebrew. I don't know where it is. If I knew, I'd be famous. But the luz bone, some people had different commentaries say where it is. But ultimately, there's always a part of us, a physical part of us that always remains in the world. So that's an important thing to remember. We're giving 2 contexts here. When we're looking at the world and we're saying, how can we affect the world? First of all, the world is not really an enemy with us. The world is not really an enemy. Really, it's God's garden. It's actually a beautiful garden for God. And we know that God will come back to it. So the world's not really an enemy of us. We can change the world because the world in its essence is really changed. And it's the same thing with us. When we do something good in the world, it lasts forever because we actually don't fully die. There's always a remnant for us in the world, and we actually don't fully die, and we're able to change the world. This was actually what God told Moses in the beginning of the Parsha, Bo El Paro. God tells Moses, he says, come with me to Pharaoh. Now, Moses refers to Pharaoh as a crocodile, right? Now, obviously, he's a human, but he refers to him as a crocodile. So the Zohar says that Paro means bursting forth. Pharaoh, a lot of times, bad things in the world, sometimes we see bad things and they're overbearing and they're powerful. The reason why they're so powerful is they're actually bursting with holiness. They're out of control. Moses saw Pharaoh and he said, such holiness that fell so low, I cannot change. God tells Moses, Bo El Paro, come with me to Pharaoh. You come with me. I'll show you. You could transform Pharaoh. And that's what happens in this week's Parsha. Pharaoh becomes transformed to Moshe. So here are two lessons that the previous rabbi gave us in the Mimer. Number one, we have to always remember, no matter how bad and how out of control the world seems, it's still God's garden, and it will return to being God's garden. And therefore, we always have to do whatever we can to bring it back, because we have the ability to return it to the way it was. That is a couple of lessons that the previous rabbi speaks about. And again, he gave this Mimer, and it was dedicated for the day he passed away. So it was like his last will. Now, I want to talk about another subject in the Mimer, which the previous rabbi talks about. The subject is called shtus. The previous rabbi there says sometimes you have to act like a fool if you want to transform the world. Sometimes you have to act like a fool. Everyone agrees?
No.
I don't know. What do you mean by like?
What do you mean?
All right, I've been giving classes for 6 years. So okay, so let me tell you what it means to act like a fool. This is a very interesting subject, and I want to give some examples. Some of them will quote from the Mimer directly, and some of them we will explore some stories in the Tanakh. So here's what happens in the Torah's history. God says, Basi Legani. He says, I came to my garden, right? Now, the Midrash connotes that God didn't come to a new garden. He came to his old garden. The world was perfect. Adam sinned, and the world became deeply imperfect. God came back when? At the giving of the Torah. What it signifies is God's divine presence, God's revealed self can only rest in the world. God's revealed self can only be in the world if the world is a vessel for it. If the world is good, then God can reveal himself. So when God gave the Torah, he returned to the world. The Midrash actually enumerates that there were 7 sins that happened, Adam and going on, and then there were 7 righteous people, starting with Abraham, and Moses was number 7. Moses brought the Shekhinah back into the world. He brought God's presence, divine presence, back into the world. What happened after the giving of the Torah? What bad thing happened? Anyone know?
The golden calf.
Golden calf. Golden calf is considered to be one of the worst sins ever. You guys literally just spoke to God face to face. Literally face to face. Nowadays, when people sin, so they usually don't know better. But there was no knowing better than before the golden calf, right? They sin, and God once again leaves the world. His presence leaves the world. What does Moses do to atone for the golden calf? He builds a tabernacle. He builds a home for God. This is what the Torah tells us. He builds a home for God. God once again will come and reside in the world. Now, the Torah tells us something very interesting. What type of wood was the tabernacle made out of? What type of wood? Anyone know? The wood was called acacia wood. But in Hebrew, the word is atse shittim. So let me just show you here what it means. Atse shittim here. Atse shittim. Atse shittim means Atse shittim means shittim wood. This is the word shittim wood. Now, the previous Rebbe explains in the Mimer. He says that shittim wood actually is the root word of shittim is shtut. Shtut means foolishness. It means foolishness. Now, there are different instances in the Torah where we find this word, foolishness. Nowadays, today in Israel, if you go to someone say, shtuyot, they'll say, that's your foolishness. Shoteh. Shoteh means a fool. That's like a bad word in Hebrew, right? You say someone's a shoteh, it means they're a fool. In the olden days, it meant someone who was like a little bit handicapped, someone who was mentally, but nowadays it's like a kind of a bad word you say to someone. You wouldn't say that about someone who's born with a condition, but you would say like, you're acting like a shoteh, you're acting like a fool. So Moses' commandment to make the Mishkan out of shittim, out of this foolish wood. Now, there are different instances in the Torah that we find such an idea. And I have one right over here. Here is a verse. Where do I have it? Over. All right. One example is at the Sota. We're studying the Sota, right? We're studying the Sota. And the Torah says, Ish kisiste ishto. when a man suspects his wife, the word for suspect, or the word that the Torah uses, it says when a lady acts like a fool, right? A lady acts like a fool. The root word of foolishness in Hebrew is to turn. A lady turns away from her husband, right? That's what a sota is. A sota is a lady who turns away from her husband. So shittim means to turn away. Shittim means to turn away. Now, Maimonides says that a person is supposed to be the best place to be health-wise. Give me just a second. The best place to be health-wise is average, right? The best place to be is average. Middle path, right? Middle path is always the simplest path. He says, don't eat average foods, do average exercises. Any extreme thing that you do in your life is unhealthy. You sometimes have people who are so healthy or so dedicated to being healthy that they actually get sick. They may be healthy in a biological, chemical way, but mentally it can cause all sorts of. Or you have someone who's so religious that they sometimes forget about regular decency. So Maimonides says to take the middle path. The problem is sometimes we act like fools and we go off. So the previous Rebbe in the Mimer says, what is acting like a fool? Acting like a fool is when we go after physical needs and pleasure. We get obsessed with physical needs and pleasure. As Jews, we're highly spiritual people. We should be dedicated to Judaism. The problem is life gets difficult and we sometimes turn off the middle path of serving God and knowing our mission in the world. How do we fix that? So the previous Rebbe explains that we fix it like Moses. We have to be, if we act crazy. Now, crazy doesn't mean the examples that the previous Rebbe gives in the Mimer is people who are crazy, obsessed with manners or American ways of things. There are certain things that sometimes we get caught, we don't even realize, but we get caught in, peer pressure or whatever it is. How do we fix it? By being crazy good. By being crazy good. This is a trait you could see by a lot of Hasidim, right? You can see by a lot of Hasidim. Now, let me just show you some examples. I'll show you some interesting examples. I'm going to share a screen. We'll show you some interesting examples and we'll stop here. Okay, so here we have the story of King David. Everyone sees it? So it says, V'David mecharker b'chol eiz lifnei Hashem, v'David chager ephod bad. David whirled with all his might before the Lord. David was girt with a linen ephod. So King David is basically dancing like crazy, right? We have this verse in Samuel 2. He's basically dancing like crazy. King David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and with blasts of the horn. So continue here. It says, as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and whirling before the Lord, and she despised him for it. Right? So she sees King David kind of dancing like crazy. They're bringing the ark into the city of David, and she despises him. They brought the ark of the Lord and they set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it, and David sacrificed burnt offering. Okay. Now we'll just go a couple verses ahead, and we have this. Michal was the daughter of King Saul. David went home to greet his household, and Michal, his wife, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "Didn't the king of Israel do himself honor today, exposing himself in the sight of all the slave girls and of his subjects, as one of the riffraff might expose himself?" So she says, "King David, you're the king. Are you sure you're supposed to expose yourself dancing like you're a Moshe?" David answers Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father, and all his family who appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will dance before God and dishonor myself even more and be low in my own esteem. But among the slave girls that you speak of, I will be honored." So King David actually, he tells her like this. He says, your father Saul was pretty mellow. Saul was meant to be very rational, but he unfortunately got caught in a lot of trouble in the end of his life. King David says that I'm dancing before the Lord. King David is bringing out this idea of sometimes you have to have shtus kedusha. Sometimes you have to be a little bit crazy for God's sake. Another example that I want to quote is one that the previous rabbi quotes in the mind. Now, one of the places where Jews act the craziest is weddings. Jews oftentimes historically dance like crazy at weddings. Now, luckily, there's actually a mitzvah. It says that Rabbi Abahu would come from the academy to the house of the emperor. The maidservants of the emperor's house would go out and greet him. And this is what they're saying to him: master of his people and leader of his nation, candle of the mission, blessed is your arrival. Okay, I'm sorry. This is the wrong part. Just give me a sec. Okay. With regard to the mitzvah of bringing joy to the bride and groom, the Gemara relates, the sages said about Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai that he would take a myrtle branch and dance before the bride and say a fair and attractive bride. So he would dance before the bride at the weddings and celebrate and praise her. Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak would base his dance on 3 myrtle branches that he would juggle. Now, Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak was a great rabbi. At this era, he was actually very old. Long white beard. He became one of the greatest rabbis in Israel of his generation. He was a teacher. He was an incredible teacher. Rab Zera, who was also a great rabbi, said, this old man is humiliating us, as through his conduct, he is demeaning the Torah and the Torah scholars. So Rabbi Zera saw his teacher, Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak, and he said, this old man is humiliating us. He's dancing like a child. He's juggling 3 myrtle branches. He's a great rabbi. He should be sitting seriously. When Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak died, a pillar of fire demarcated between him and everyone else. And we learn through tradition that the pillar of fire demarcates only for either one person in a generation or for 2 people in a generation. So here he's disgraced by this teacher, right? He's disgraced by this teacher, Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai. Can you hear me? I just froze.
Oh, we can hear you.
Okay. So he's disgraced by this teacher, right? And he says, this old man is embarrassing to us. Rabbi Yehuda when he dies, there's a big pillar of fire comes down and separates him between all other people, which only comes in once a generation. He sees this man is beyond everyone else. Now, in other places, it says the fire looked like a willow branch, actually. Rabbi Zera says his branch, shotite, was effective for the old man. Because he did the mitzvah of dancing with these branches before the bride, he was privileged to receive this great reward. Some say Rav Zera said his nonsense was effective for the old man, and some say his method was effective for the old man. But either way, what we see is when we're in this world, especially in America, where the previous rabbi actually, his feeling was in America, you had a lot of Jewish people who were very well-mannered, but they were giving up Judaism. He felt that the antidote is we need to tell people, and we need to go out there and sometimes even look a little crazy doing it. But tell people, the Jewish people, that this world is a garden and we can live with a higher purpose and spread that message to the whole world, and we'll reach the whole world. Last night we watched a video, or the Robinsons were with us, about them broadcasting the Farbrengens, the rabbit talks to the rabbit by satellite, they're putting on TV. So it's interesting. One of the interesting things is it's interesting that, oh man, my camera's not working. The Rebbe would speak about this, and when he would do that, he would actually speak to all people, Jews, Gentiles alike. This is the message we have to remember. Number one, we have to remember that there's never a world where God is not in control. And whatever we see in the world is only an opportunity to go and spread Judaism, spread goodness in the world, and we're still doing it. We have to do it now, and sometimes we have to like a fool in a good way. And when we do that, we'll bring the coming of Mashiach. I just want to share one letter of the previous Rebbe, which I saw a couple of weeks ago, which was quite fascinating. There was the Freedom America, and he was very the previous rabbi came and he was very desperate to spread Judaism. The problem was many Jews already assimilated. Many Jews, he knew their parents, he knew their family, they were religious in the old country, they had already assimilated in America. But nonetheless, he would go right to them and say, hey, remember, try and help this.
You break it up.
You're breaking up, Rabbi, and now we can't hear you.
He's not talking.
The screen is frozen.
Yeah.
Give me a second. Just give me a second.
Sometimes.
All right. Hello, can you hear me?
Right. Sometimes.
Excuse me.
God bless you.
Can you hear me?
No.
All right, my device went out. I gotta stop here.
Okay.
Hi, guys.
All right, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now, yes, we can now.
All right, I just wanted to share something. I'll share it another time, but my device went out, so we're gonna have to stop here. My camera's not working and my mic is not working well, so we'll continue next time. Thank you
Okay.
for joining today.
Okay,
That is
thanks,
the legacy. That is the legacy of the previous Rebbe. To remember that, no matter how grave things get in the world, we always have to remember to be givers to the world and go out and transform the world and do what it takes. And we will see that will come a time where the world becomes God's place again, and everyone will see it and know it with the coming of Mashiach.
Bye, Rabbi.
Bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you for
Matt.
joining.